OCO, hello everyone, and welcome back to Speaking Our Truth Podcast for Change, a podcast by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I am your host, Leanne Pippin, and I'm a member of Cherokee Nation. Before we get started, let's hear a word from the NIWRC.
The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center offers culturally grounded resources and materials to support tribal domestic violence programs and grassroots advocates. Learn more at niwrc.org/resources.
Native women face some of the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual violence in the nation. They also face increasingly disparate rates of homelessness and housing insecurity. This episode of Speaking Our Truth features part 2 of the Specialty Institute recorded in June, led by the STTARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center. It will continue to address the spectrum of housing issues for Indigenous victim survivors. Widow, thank you for listening.
Housing and shelter issues. So what are we talking about? For AIAN survivors in Indian country or in off-reservation spaces, we're looking at a serious lack of shelter options being number one. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's virtually no housing inventory in the United States in general at the moment. This is not specific, right, to just tribal communities or communities where Native Americans or Alaska Natives live. It's everywhere. So you're seeing this just kind of writ large across the country. It's why the Fed lowered their interest rate, right? But without housing inventory, it's really hard to do things like emergency vouchers or transfers for people. If you don't have the places for people to go, those things start to not work, right? We have spaces that are unsafe. They're not trauma informed, spaces that actually cause a lot of harm to Native survivors of gender-based violence. We've got housing that's not habitable. I would point you to a 2017 report that HUD's ONAP office published, in which they talk about really a lot of these issues around habitability, seeing things like not having clean water, no access to electricity, right? These things that we think that we need for habitable housing. Spaces that are not culturally rooted. There is little to no transitional housing. Housing and shelter that's not sustainable. So either, right, we put a serious time limitation on a survivor's access to that space. We say you only have 30 days, right? We condition it with all sorts of different rules, which we know isn't sustainable with the survivor. And then also sustainability in terms of environmental impacts. The big one to us, I think, that we saw, especially coming out of our work group and sort of talking with individuals as we developed the center, was that there are a lot of problematic mindsets around who should have access to housing and shelter. Even though people are willing to say housing is a human right, they are not willing to make housing that's not conditional, like where we create all of these conditions for access for survivors. And I'm sure many of you who work in these spaces have numerous examples of where that has become an issue. Even things like clean UAs, right? Having to prove that you are not using any sort of substances to maintain your housing, right? That's not housing as a human right. That's housing as a conditioned access point. So it's really thinking through some of these things. And of course, like I'm sure many of you have additional items that ideally you'd like to see added to that list. And we would love to hear about that in the chat if you want to post anything that you're seeing in your communities or just things maybe you don't agree with, right? Just anything that you want to have further conversation on. Okay, so one of the things that obviously you do when you start a new center is you do your strategic plan. We want to go through this with people again, because I think it's good to share with people where we're at, but it's also good to receive feedback. Especially from people that we do work with in this space and community and grassroots advocates. So where did we see the Tribal Safe Housing Center in 20 years? These were the 3 things that we really wanted to focus on: ensuring safety and belonging in community through Indigenous lifeways, dismantling systemic and endemic barriers to ensure safe housing for all, which obviously is a huge ask. And I also just kind of want to acknowledge that I feel like today is very heavy coming off of last week and certain Supreme Court decisions, right? And even thinking about number 2 is like very hard right now. So I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that. That's where my head's at right now. And then centering culturally rooted resources, practices, and policies for social change. These are the things that we wanted to see the Housing Center do in the next 20 years. What were some of the underlying contradictions to reaching those plans? These are the things that we identified. Diversity as a challenge in navigating safe housing outcomes. This isn't meant to say diversity is a barrier. It's more meant to say that diversity in housing options is actually a barrier to addressing things. Everywhere has their own sets of laws, codes, ordinances, regulations, right? Housing is just a super regulated space in general. Some places have transitional housing, other places do not. Sometimes hotel vouchers are where people are going, but they don't necessarily have the transportation piece, right? So there's just all sorts of little things to consider, but even just the housing spectrum itself is really broad, right? We're not just talking about emergency shelter access, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and then rent or ownership, right? We're talking about people who are in alternative forms of shelter, people who are in sober living. We're talking about survivors who are couch surfing, survivors who are in encampments, right? There's all just sorts of various ways in which the housing spectrum makes this complicated. The second barrier that we identified was non-Indigenous systems destruction of Indigenous lifeways. This is obviously a historical issue since time immemorial, and it's a big hurdle to get over, especially as we work and navigate in these spaces, which are funded by Western dollars, right? The third are equity issues in the anti-violence movement. I'm sure everybody has an example of this they can post in the chat, or if you just wanted to head over to the wellness and self-care tab on HOVA, I'm sure you can suggest things for people to do to regain their sense of self when having to deal with these issues. It's not a super controversial thing to say that BIPOC people experience marginalization often by the organizations they attempt to interact with, right? An inversion of Indigenous worldviews, and then ongoing and active settler violence. And we just sort of put that out right in front of the center because we think that that's important to address, and it's not something to shy away from naming and putting some truth to. Gwen, did you want to add anything? I feel like I'm talking too much right now.
No, I'd just like to add that the little turtle you see was created by Caroline.
Yeah, I drew that on my iPad, y'all. Don't be too impressed. It's a moment of wanting to distract myself from my responsibilities. Okay. Okay, so shelter in Indian country. One thing that we know, and I used to work at Strong Hearts Native Helpline as a policy person. And so when we were partnering with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, they graciously gave us access to a lot of information that was helpful sort of in making some arguments around, in particular, VOCA, Victims of Crime Act funding, and the need for it in Indian country. But nationally, there are over 1,500 domestic violence shelters in the United States. Right. And despite there being 574 federally recognized tribes, and of course, despite the disparate rates and exponential percentages of violence that we experience in our communities, nationally, there are fewer than 50 tribal domestic violence shelters. This is a huge issue. It means people have to leave, right? Or it means that they are going to stay with an abuser. It means that they're more likely to have to access mainstream resources, which don't necessarily fit their cultural needs. There's a whole host of reasons why this is problematic, but it's something that really needs to be addressed. It's something that our housing center is hoping to work towards in the future. So our work approach, and again, this is just a general intro session to STARS. Later on in the day, we're going to get into more specific TA and over day 2 and day 3 as well. But just thinking about ways in which, people might want to collaborate with us, for example, and just really sort of giving you an idea of what we're going to be up to. So the first was listening sessions with survivors. We are paying survivors for their time. Second are site visits to various communities. We've already been to Portland, Seattle, Lummi. We have been to a few youth shelters in Anchorage. Basically, anywhere that we're traveling, we're trying to fit in a site visit with a local space. We're doing the routine, right? Like podcast fact sheets, brochures, just to get the information out. We're doing a newsletter to keep people informed. And if you haven't already, I would definitely really appreciate it, actually, if you'd sign up for our listserv. Conducting key informant interviews. When we were in Alaska, we had the opportunity to go to HUD ONAP's regional office there and conduct a key informant interview. We've also worked with some programs to conduct key informant interviews. And so those have been really great. We're facilitating our work group. So the work group that really was the impetus for starting the center is going to continue. We've already had our first meeting of the year, and we're scheduling a second meeting in Minnesota. Training and technical assistance, specifically on these issues, the intersection of gender-based violence, housing insecurity, and homelessness. We have our resource library, which is already up and launched. We are in the process of developing our speakers bureau, again, specific to shelter and housing access. We've got our tribal safe housing clearinghouse, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and then strategic partners and MOUs, which we discussed right when we started. Okay, I'm not going to go into this too much, but I do think it's good for people to sort of have like in their mind where to find these provisions, especially for when we talk about it on Thursday at the last session. This is where you're going to find the safe housing provisions in the Violence Against Women Act. They have been changed 2005, 2013 to 2022, right? Specific to the housing. Obviously, I know that the Violence Against Women Act was enacted in 94, but this is where you're going to find those sections. It's section 601 through 606 that focus very specifically on housing. There's other provisions that we'll talk about on Thursday that like tangentially touch on it, in particular around incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, LGBTQ, and Native Hawaiians, which we'll get into too. But this is where you're going to find these, and I just wanted you to have them today in case you wanted to review them prior to that session. There were changes to it, compliance reviews, which should improve overall implementation. Obviously, there was funding for training and technical assistance that was increased. This is the big piece. It actually amended the McKinney-Vento Act's definition of homelessness to more accurately reflect the experiences of survivors, in particular sexual assault survivors. There are two provisions that we're kind of keeping an eye on within that definition. It's something we're going to be working on within our work group, but again, we'll discuss that more on Thursday. It included the right to report crime without risking your right to housing and additional anti-retaliation provisions than we saw in 2005. Reauthorizes and improves the VAWA transitional housing program. It basically just increased the amount of funding. There's a study on victims of trafficking as related to housing. There's a 2-year time limit on when HUD and other federal agencies needed to promulgate regulations in regards to the new provisions from VAWA 2022, and that it very importantly codified the VAWA housing director position. But I think the McKinley-Vento Act piece of it is what we're going to spend most of our time. All right, Tribal Housing Code Clearinghouse. This is super important. These beautiful people in this photo are volunteers with our center. They work at the Human Rights Clinic at Cordoza in New York. And part of the reason we partner with the Human Rights Clinic is because we are really centering human rights framing in our work, right? So Brett, who's there in the middle, is collecting tribal housing codes by going really tribal website to tribal website and through Westlaw, I believe, to collect some of these codes and start analyzing them, especially where sometimes they might be slightly problematic, right? So like nuisance ordinances, things that we're still seeing. We're also looking at orders related to COVID responses and public health issues with housing, hoping people will collaborate around standing operating procedures, policies, practices of care, especially for shelters, and then best practices. And there are a lot of really amazing best practices that we've already uncovered within the tribal housing codes that are available. But we're going to talk about more on Thursday as well. So I just have this like very shameless plug of the QR code here that you see. And if you just open up your phone, open up your camera and hold it up to that QR code, it should open up a form. And that form will enable you to provide us with input on what you're seeing in your own community, provide us with codes that you've seen, or talk about issues that you're experiencing, right? And we're just in the process of collecting that information now. So it's just something to collaborate with us on as well. But we'll talk about that more on Thursday. I'm not going to go through this too much. This is just moving forward. But we did launch our website again, and that's the one thing I want to redraw people's attention to, which is NIWRC.org and then /housing. This photo and a few of the other photos are actually from site visits that we went on from certain organizations that we're working with. Okay, I think I miraculously made it in the time limit, but I wanted to say thank you. There is my contact information via email and Gwen's as well as Denise's. If you want to collaborate with us, if you have feedback, if you've got thoughts or additional questions, please just reach out via email and we would be more than happy to respond or work with you in the future. So I just want to say thank you for your time, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the Specialty Institute and the more technical presentations the remainder of the day.
For those listening and want to learn more about STARS, Indigenous Safe Housing Center, visit niwrc.org/housing. There you will find links to follow them on social media. Their handle is @safehousing4all with the number 4. And don't forget to sign up for their mailing list. Thank you for joining us. I have been your host, Leanne Pippin with NIWRC. You can listen to more episodes of Speaking Our Truth Podcast for Change at niwrc.org/podcast. Widow, and thank you so much for sharing space with us today. Be well.